Hello, everybody. My name is Titoni Crenshaw, and I had Chapter 7 Behavior Responsibilities from James M. Johnston, Book of Radical Behavior for ABA Practitioners. The first subtitle I will discuss in this chapter is creativity. What is creativity? Creativity must be the thing that we seemingly possess a certain amount of. An example of this is a friend showing you a painting that he made and you have little artistic background. You might be inclined to compliment their creativity. But if you then discover his painting was a copy of someone else, you might want to retract your assessment. Creativity is not a physical phenomenon, but a way of labeling certain kinds of behaviors. As humans, we tend to call behavior unfamiliar with what is created or when we are not aware of what might have influenced such behavior. Our conventional verbal practice fails to provide good reason for supposing that creativity is a distinct quality of human nature. We sometimes think of creative behavior as novel, but variations in responding are one of the characteristics of response class and part of the fundamental nature of apparent behaviors. Apparent behaviors rarely lack a reinforcement history. Though faced with any particular instance, we can usually make educated guesses at how the individual history contributes to a response. Apparent behavior is novel when it is likely to be part of an existing response class. An example of this is when a child responds verbally to seeing a dog. The details of response may vary from one occasion to the next. The child may call the dog numerous names such as dog, doggy, or puppy, but because all responses to the dog occur in the dog's presence, the result ends up being similar social reinforcers. In this chapter, Skinner is referenced for noting that we call the result of an apparent response class a phenomenon. The behavior we label as creative depends on our experience with the behavior in question. If we are familiar with the behavior in question, we may be less inclined to label it as creative. Creative behavior comes from a history of reinforcement for behaving in a certain way under similar circumstances. This means we can produce creative behavior by arranging the risk kind of reinforcement. This analysis suggests that creative behavior is the result of our individual reinforcement histories, which should mean that we can engineer those histories to encourage individuals to emit more or less creative behavior. We as humans may define it under different circumstances. An example of this is a person having a long musical history is more likely to impress others with their musical creativity than someone who lacks a musical background. The topic of creativity illustrates that benefits of replacing a colloquial view of behavior with perspectives rooted in established science. The everyday view implies that creativity is an inner quality that is present to varying degrees from one person to another, and the responsibility of creativity lies within the individual and not the environment. An important factor in approaching creativity is a matter of environmental contingencies, is that we can nurture this sort of behavior when we wish. An example of this is we want children to write a creative story so we can build the necessary skills and tendencies with the right kind of opportunity and reinforcement contingencies. The next subtitle I will discuss is credit where credit is due. When we find creative accomplishments, it is nature to offer recognition and praise. When we praise the accomplishment of others or offer other kinds of emoluments, this outcome presumably function as reinforcing, thereby making such efforts more likely. We risk weakening laudatory behavior when we fail to compliment or praise. All behavior is the result of history and the particular interchanges within the environment. This states that praiseworthy behavior does not come with somewhere inside us, but from our experience, no matter how obscure the evidence in each instance. It is important to reinforce desirable behavior when if it did not mysteriously come from within the behaving individual, but from an environmental history. The notion of giving credit for a good behavior may misunderstand its origin. It implies that the behavior originated in the person rather than from a reinforcement history. This misunderstanding might encourage the assumption that some people are more prone to certain forms of good behavior, such as creativity, than others. Individuals should provide opportunity for good behaviors to emerge, even if it is conceded that such behavior should be explicitly encouraged. It is not clear how this might be done if the behavior originated in the individual. The notion of reinforcing the person misunderstands the nature of reinforcement, which is effects on response classes, not the individual as a whole. Recognizing creativity or other laudatory behavior as a tact on the part of the speaker encourages a focus on targeted reinforcement contingencies. When we say that a person has learned something and is behaviorally stronger as a result, we are invariably referring to changes in the feature of particular response classes. Because it is impossible to reinforce the individuals as such, attempts to encourage creativity is an inequality typically result in reinforcement contingencies that are likely to yield scattered outcomes. As objective change, reinforcement may be offered in a general manner in effect to strengthen vague creative tendencies. The next subtitle is, Are We Then Blameless? If the idea of giving credit is misplaced, it follows the same misunderstanding as associated with the idea of blaming the individual for their behavior. It may be important to arrange consequences for undesirable behavior. An example of this is the appreciation of promoting good table manners by pointing out that we protest the appreciation of good table manners by pointing out that the person does not deserve any credit because the behavior was an expected result of a reinforcement history. Desirable behavior states that the person misunderstands the nature of apparent behavior and therefore fails to take advantage of their power of well-designed contingencies to make undesirable unlikely. Why undesirable behavior is the result from environmental history that is associated with each different behavior that is not from a vague inner motivation. Desirable behavior fails to recognize the role of culture in setting the standards for acceptable and unacceptable behavior. We are not more than what we do, and everything we do, including behavior, may be aversive to others, come from our environmental history, right up to our present circumstances. The apparent contradiction, as with the notion of giving credit, is that while the individual is not blaming as the source of his or her behavior, the contingencies associated with blaming someone for their action can be important in making it less likely that the individual will misbehave that way in the future. Sometimes our desire to blame others for their misfortune results in political agendas that can stand off our ability to resolve challenging social issues. An example of this is someone may blame poor people for their predicament, arguing that if they only chose better or tried harder along the way to strive for a better life, they will be able to lift themselves up on their own. This is an unavoidable mentalistic view because it assigns the source of behavior to a mental quality or influences we call choosing or trying. The next subtitle to be discussed, it comes down to responsibility. If everyday understanding of responsibility implies a self-descriptive verbal repertoire and the freedom to choose a course of action, the latter requirement cannot be met, which must lead to the assumption that all behavior is instead determined. The colloquial notion or responsibility acknowledges that requirement by excusing individuals who unavoidably lack self-awareness. An example of this, we do not hold babies or even young children responsible for their own behavior. This goes for individuals with severe intellectual disability as well as individuals who are limited by mental illness or drugs. When we begin to require awareness, the traditional concept of responsibility also assumes we are free to choose one course of action over another. On the flip side of things, if individuals lack this choice, they are less likely to be held accountable for their action. An example of this would be a child running into the street and getting hit by a car. If the driver of the car is seen to be driving safe in the eyes of the law, he would not be prosecuted. But if it is deemed that he broke a law, he will be prosecuted for hitting the child. Personally, responsibility in different cultures are very volatile. An example of this would be in many cultures, women who is raped is considered the responsible party. It's the norm for us to be held people accountable because of their actions if they had a choice about how they behave. The greater the evidence of external causal factors, the less someone is seen answerable for their behavior. An example of this is a person engaged in illegal activities such as speeding. Due to a pressing situation such as taking a family member to the hospital, emergency room, the violation that has been created may be executed. This shows the evidence of self-awareness and free choice diminish and weakens the burden of responsibility for the person. The last subtitle I will discuss is conscience. Our sense of shame or guilt comes from a long history of being punished for misbehavior. An example of this would be hitting your little brother very hard till he starts to cry. We knew we were going to get in trouble, but we still denied it. Parental rules and cultural rules is what mans us as children. The thought of being punished brought upon a physiological effect. Getting hit with a belt produced an illicit degree of autonomic nervous system arouses some sensations of which we can detect. Our verbal community teaches us to not only discriminate these sensations, but to tag them as shame or guilt under certain circumstances. My open-ended question was, what is the conceptual risk associated with the culture notion of giving credit? The answer I came up with is that this question implies that behavior originates in the person rather than from a reinforcement history. This is stating that behavior is caused by a mental event and is not part of history that has been learned. Thank you for viewing my presentation, and have a great day.